He knocked like a boy who had already been beaten, knuckles barely grazing the wood, as though afraid the sound itself might earn him pain. Daniel Carter opened the door to find a child no older than 9 swaying on his porch, cheeks hollow, eyes rimmed red. In his small hands he clutched a torn cloth sack that carried nothing but air. His voice cracked, brittle and broken. "My father will whip me if I don't bring food." The words cut deeper than any winter wind. Daniel stood frozen, caught between the sight of the boy's trembling frame and the terrible truth of his plea. No outlaw stood before him, no drifter scheming for coins, just a child with hunger written in every line of his body. Daniel had seen hunger before. He'd known it as a boy, back when his own father's fists were heavier than bread, when every day meant waiting to see if mercy would come with morning light. And yet the ache of memory did nothing to dull the sharpness of this moment. The boy pressed a fist to his stomach as it growled, a hollow echo in the silence. "Please," he whispered, eyes darting to the side as if even asking was dangerous. He'll know I failed." Daniel didn't ask who he was. He didn't need to. There was only one kind of man who sent children to beg while threatening the whip if they returned empty-handed. For a moment, Daniel considered the bread cooling on his table, his only loaf, meant to last him until Sunday's ride into town. Then he looked at the boy again, shoulders drawn up as though bracing for the lash that would surely fall if he returned with nothing. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe, then with a slow breath he stepped back. "Come inside." The boy's eyes widened, not with relief but with confusion, as though kindness was stranger than cruelty. He hesitated, feet rooted to the porch. "I just need food," he stammered. "I can't stay, if he finds out." Daniel's voice cut firm but gentle, carrying the tone of a man who knew the weight of secrets kept out of fear. "Inside, boy. Cold air won't fill your belly." At last the boy stepped across the threshold. His boots were worn through at the sole, his coat no thicker than a rag. Daniel shut the door against the cutting wind, the sound of the latch clicking into place more final than any vow. Inside, the fire crackled low, shadows dancing against the log walls. Daniel motioned to the table where the loaf waited, still soft, steam curling faint from its crust. It wasn't much, but it was everything. He cut thick slices, pushing the plate toward the boy without another word. The child reached out, trembling, then snatched his hand back as though expecting to be struck for daring to touch. Daniel didn't move, didn't rush him. He only watched as the boy's hunger finally overcame his fear. He seized the bread, biting deep, crumbs scattering across the wood. For a moment the cabin filled with nothing but the sound of desperate chewing, the muffled sob that slipped from the boy's throat when he realized no hand was coming to stop him. Daniel leaned back, arms crossed, his own stomach tightening at the sight. It wasn't the boy's hunger that hurt, it was the memory of his own. Years ago he had been that child, alone, desperate, trembling at the thought of punishment that always came, no matter how hard he tried to please. And now here was this boy, caught in the same noose of fear. When at last the boy slowed, crumbs clinging to his lips, he glanced up, guilt etched in every line of his face. "I'll pay you back," he said quickly, voice cracking. "I'll do chores, I can work, I'll." Daniel shook his head. "You owe me nothing." The boy swallowed hard, shaking his head as though unable to believe it. "But my father," his words stopped short, strangled by terror. He dropped his gaze to the table, shoulders hunching in on themselves. Daniel studied him in silence. There was a story here, one that bled through every word left unsaid. A story written in bruises that peeked faintly from beneath the boy's collar, in the way he flinched at the creak of the cabin's rafters. Daniel didn't push. He remembered all too well what it meant to live with secrets that burned like brands on the skin, but he also knew secrets couldn't stay buried forever. The boy took another bite of bread, smaller this time, deliberate, as though stretching it out might delay the reckoning that awaited him when he returned home. His small hands clenched tight around the crust, knuckles white. He chewed slowly, eyes darting now and then toward the door. Daniel's jaw set. The boy wasn't just hungry, he was trapped. And Daniel Carter, for all his loneliness and scars, knew one thing for certain. He would not stand by and watch another child suffer the way he once had. "Boy," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady as the crackle of the fire, "what's your name?" The child hesitated, then whispered, "Thomas." Daniel nodded. The name hung heavy in the air, like the first step on a trail neither of them could turn back from. And in that moment, Daniel understood. This was no simple exchange of bread for silence. This was the beginning of something that would change both their lives, whether they were ready or not. Thomas sat hunched at the table, crumbs clinging to his lips, the crust of bread still clutched in his hand as though someone might snatch it away at any moment. Daniel Carter watched the boy carefully, his own coffee cooling untouched before him. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, rattling faint like restless fingers. The world beyond his cabin was vast and merciless, yet it was the small figure before him that filled the room with a tension Daniel hadn't felt in years. "Eat slow," Daniel murmured after a long silence. "It'll sit better." Thomas nodded quickly, but his bites were still too quick, too desperate. Each chew seemed like a race against some unseen hourglass, each swallow burdened with the knowledge that time was slipping and punishment was waiting. Daniel recognized it. He'd lived it once. A hunger not just for food, but for safety, for the faintest reprieve from fear. The fire snapped, sparks flickering up the stone chimney. Daniel let the quiet linger, knowing that pressing too hard would shatter whatever fragile trust was forming. But when Thomas's eyes flicked toward the door again, Daniel's gut tightened. The boy wasn't only scared of hunger or of the cold. He was scared of going home. "Your father," Daniel said evenly, watching Thomas flinch before he even finished the words. "What kind of man sends his boy out into the night for food he knows ain't there?" Thomas froze, the crust halfway to his mouth. His shoulders hunched forward, a shield against words that cut too close. He shook his head quickly, eyes dropping to the table. He gets angry," Thomas whispered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "He says I'm no good, says if I don't learn how to bring food, then I'll never be worth feeding." Daniel's jaw clenched so tight it ached. He'd heard those same words, nearly word for word, years ago, spoken by a father who had confused cruelty for strength, who thought fists could forge boys into men. Daniel had walked away from that house at 16, never looking back. But looking at Thomas now, he realized some boys never got the chance to walk away. "You're worth more than that," Daniel said finally, his voice low but sharp as a knife. Thomas looked up then, startled, as if the words themselves were something foreign. His lip trembled, and for a brief second Daniel thought he might cry. But the boy swallowed hard, forcing the tears back down, and shook his head again. "If I don't bring food, he'll whip me." The words came in a rush, like a secret ripped free against his will. "He don't care if it's winter, he don't care if I'm hungry, he'll just—" Thomas stopped himself, biting down on the rest. But the tremble in his hands spoke louder than anything he could have said. Daniel's chest tightened, rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had lived long enough to know what happened to boys beaten down until they broke. Some grew cruel themselves, passing on the same pain like a disease. Others grew hollow, fading into ghosts that haunted the world long before their bodies gave up. Neither fate was acceptable for this child, not if Daniel had any say. "Thomas," Daniel said, softer now, "how long since you had a full meal?" Thomas stared at the floorboards. "I don't remember." The words landed like a stone. Daniel rose from his chair, moving to the shelf where he kept what little he had: beans, flour, dried venison. It wasn't much, not enough to last him through the month, but that didn't matter. He pulled what he could, setting it down in a sack at the boy's feet. Thomas's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. I can't take all that," Thomas stammered. "He'll know it ain't mine, he'll know I did." His voice faltered. He clutched the crust of bread tighter, as though it were safer to take a single slice and risk less punishment than to carry plenty and risk disbelief. Daniel crouched down, leveling his gaze with the boy's. Listen to me. No man with a heart worth having would question how his boy found food in a storm. If your father does, then it ain't food he's after, it's control. Thomas blinked rapidly, confusion clouding his expression. Control. Daniel nodded. He wants you scared, hungry, makes it easier to keep you under his boot. But hear me, Thomas, fear don't last forever. Sooner or later, even a boy finds the strength to stand. Thomas shook his head, fear tightening his features. If I go home with too much, he'll know. He'll hurt me worse. Daniel hesitated, weighing the truth of it. He could send Thomas away with just enough to keep suspicion at bay, but every fiber in him screamed against it. The idea of letting the boy walk back into that house, into the hands of a man who saw him as nothing but a tool to break, it made Daniel's stomach twist. You don't have to go back tonight, Daniel said suddenly. The boy's head snapped up, eyes wide. I have to. If I don't, he'll come looking. His voice shook as he added, he always finds me. Daniel straightened, running a hand across his beard as the fire popped again behind him. The boy's words weren't just fear, they were fact. Whoever Thomas's father was, he had the kind of grip that didn't loosen easily. Daniel knew men like that. He'd buried more than one in his time, men who thought cruelty was power. The boy looked toward the door again, panic rising. He'll come, Thomas whispered. If I'm not home, he'll come. Daniel took a slow breath, the weight of the moment pressing down. He could let Thomas go, send him back into the cold with scraps enough to stave off a whipping. Or he could do what every instinct told him was right. Keep the boy safe, even if it meant facing whatever storm followed. The choice felt less like a decision and more like destiny. Daniel Carter had lived alone long enough. He had prayed for purpose, for a reason to endure the silence of his days. And here, trembling in his cabin, sat the answer. Then let him come, Daniel said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a vow. Thomas stared at him, too stunned to speak. Outside, the wind had died, leaving behind a silence more haunting than any storm. It was in that silence Daniel knew. The boy's father wasn't the only danger. Men like that didn't stay satisfied with whipping their own. They spread their cruelty outward, poisoning everything around them. And if Thomas's father came looking, Daniel would be ready. For the first time in years, the lonely rancher felt the stir of something more than survival. He felt the stir of defiance. The fire had burned low by the time Daniel stirred from his chair. Thomas had fallen asleep at the table, his small frame hunched over, cheek pressed against his folded arms, the crust of bread still clutched in one hand as though it were treasure. The boy's breaths came shallow and uneven, the kind of rest that never reached deep enough to heal. Daniel studied him in the dim glow, the quiet broken only by the hiss of sap in the logs. Every scar the boy carried, seen and unseen, spoke of a life carved by cruelty. Daniel knew if he sent him back, the cycle would continue until the boy became something unrecognizable, either hollowed out or hardened into a reflection of the man who tormented him. Daniel rose slowly, careful not to wake him, and moved to the window. Beyond the frost-slick glass, the land lay heavy with silence. Snow stretched across the fields, pale under the muted moonlight, the fences buried to their rails. It should have been beautiful, but all Daniel felt was unease. The boy's words echoed in his mind. He always finds me. That was not the cry of a child afraid of shadows. That was the fear of someone who had been hunted before. He returned to the table, pulling the blanket from the bench and draping it carefully over Thomas's shoulders. The boy stirred, murmuring something incoherent before falling back into his fragile slumber. Daniel lingered for a moment, hand hovering near his shoulder, before pulling back. He had learned long ago that touch, even kind, could feel like fire to those who had only known it in anger. Instead, Daniel sat across from him again, staring into the flames. His mind traveled backward, against his will, to nights when he had been the one listening for footsteps in the dark, waiting for the creak of floorboards that meant punishment was coming. He remembered the way his mother had tried to shield him until she no longer could, The way his father's voice had filled the house like a curse that could not be prayed away. He remembered leaving at 16, never looking back, swearing to himself that if he ever had a family, no hand of his would ever strike in anger. But he never had a family. Until now, perhaps. The thought unsettled him. He hadn't asked for this. He had built his life around solitude, around the safety of silence. Yet here was this boy, dropped at his doorstep by hunger and fear, reshaping Daniel's world with every ragged breath. Morning came slow, light slipping pale through the cracks in the shutters. Thomas was awake before Daniel, sitting stiff in the chair, the blanket pooled around his waist. His eyes darted toward the door the way a sparrow eyes the sky when a hawk is near. "You'll need breakfast," Daniel said gruffly, pushing himself up. "A man can't face the day on crumbs." Thomas hesitated before nodding, though the word man seemed to sit heavy on his shoulders. Daniel fried what little bacon he had left, the scent filling the cabin. Thomas ate quietly, each bite quick but controlled, as though he'd been taught not to appear greedy even when starving. Halfway through the meal, a sound cut through the morning calm, the faint echo of hooves striking frozen ground. Daniel stiffened, every muscle taut. Thomas froze mid-bite, eyes wide, face draining of color. "He's here," Thomas whispered. Daniel moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see the dark line of riders cresting the ridge. Two men, one mounted tall and broad, the other riding slightly behind. Even from this distance, Daniel could read the swagger in their posture, the arrogance in the way the lead rider sat his horse. He didn't need Thomas to confirm it. This was the father. The boy's fork clattered against the plate as he scrambled to his feet. I have to go, if he finds me here." Daniel caught his arm before he reached the door. The boy flinched hard at the touch, but Daniel held him steady without force. "You ain't going anywhere." His voice was iron, steady and immovable. Terror filled Thomas's eyes. "You don't understand. If he comes inside and I'm here, he'll—" Daniel cut him off. "If he comes inside, he'll deal with me." The boy shook his head violently. "You don't know him. He don't stop. He don't care who's in his way." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Neither do I." The words hung between them, and for the first time, Thomas's fear faltered. He searched Daniel's face, as though trying to decide whether this man could truly stand against the storm that had ruled his life. The hooves drew closer, crunching against frozen earth, the sound louder with every passing second. Daniel released Thomas's arm gently, moving toward the rifle that hung by the door. He checked the chamber, loaded as always, then set it back in its place. He didn't want this to be about bullets. Not yet. The knock came heavy, a fist against the wood, loud enough to rattle the hinges. Thomas whimpered, shrinking back, his small frame pressed into the shadows. Daniel opened the door. The man on the porch was tall, shoulders broad, his face lined not by labor but by years of drink and rage. His eyes were sharp, cruel, set beneath a brow that furrowed with perpetual disdain. Behind him, another man, likely a hired hand, sat on horseback, watching with cold indifference. "You've got something of mine," the man said without preamble, his voice dripping with entitlement. Daniel leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, calm but unyielding. "Don't reckon I do." The man's gaze narrowed. "My boy came this way last night, didn't come home. Folks around here know better than to cross me, so unless you want trouble, you'll hand him over." Behind Daniel, Thomas let out a strangled breath, barely audible, but the father's eyes flicked past him, catching the movement. His lips curled into a smile that chilled the air more than the frost. "There he is," he said softly, like a predator spotting prey. Daniel stepped forward, blocking the doorway fully, his voice low and deliberate. "You sent a starving child into the night. He came here near froze and half dead from hunger. He ain't yours to claim anymore." The man's smile faded, replaced by a sneer. "He's mine by blood, and blood don't break easy. Step aside, rancher." Daniel didn't move. Not tonight, not ever again. For a long moment the porch held nothing but silence, the tension stretched taut as wire. The father's hand twitched near the whip at his belt, his eyes burning with the promise of violence. Behind him, the hired hand shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. Thomas pressed deeper into the cabin's shadows, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. He had seen this before, the moment before the lash, the pause before the pain. But this time was different. This time someone stood between him and the storm. The father leaned closer, voice dropping to a hiss. "You'll regret this. No man keeps what's mine and lives to tell it." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Then try me." The man's eyes darkened, his sneer twisting into something feral. He stepped back, spitting into the snow. "You've just made yourself an enemy, Carter, and I don't lose." With that, he turned, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. The two riders wheeled their horses and rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the gray horizon. But Daniel knew this was no retreat. It was a promise. He closed the door, the latch clicking like a drumbeat of finality. Thomas stared at him, trembling, his voice small and broken. "He'll come back. He always comes back." Daniel crouched down, meeting the boy's eyes, steady and unshaken. "Then we'll be ready." And in that vow lay the spark of something larger than either of them. A fight not just for survival, but for freedom. The day passed beneath a shroud of tension. Though the riders had vanished beyond the ridge, Daniel knew their absence meant little. Men like Thomas's father did not let go. They circled, they planned, and when they struck, they came with venom meant to remind everyone who held power. Inside the cabin, the fire burned hot, yet the boy sat cold, knees drawn to his chest, eyes darting at every groan of the timbers. He hadn't touched the stew Daniel cooked, though the scent of venison and beans filled the room. Hunger gnawed at him, but fear gnawed deeper. Daniel didn't press him. He knew what it meant to live in waiting, to sit braced for the sound of a boot on the porch, for a door flung open without warning. The waiting alone could strip a soul bare. Daniel busied himself with tasks he didn't truly need to do, sharpening tools already keen, stacking wood already split, mending tack that had never broken. Every strike of the whetstone, every swing of the axe, was less about the work and more about showing Thomas something wordless. Strength lived here, not cruelty. Protection, not punishment. But the boy's silence was a wound that wouldn't close. By dusk, Daniel found him sitting by the window, watching the trail vanish into the tree line. His small fingers traced the frost on the glass, eyes unfocused. "You expecting him tonight?" Daniel asked softly. Thomas jumped, startled by the sound, before nodding without looking away. "He don't wait long. If I don't come home, he comes for me. Always." Daniel's chest tightened. The boy spoke as though it were law carved into stone, as though he were property instead of flesh and blood. "Thomas," Daniel said, steadying his voice, "what do you think he'll do when he gets here?" The boy's lips pressed into a thin line. His small shoulders rose, then fell. "He'll beat me first," he whispered. "Then he'll make me watch him take everything you got, food, money, animals. He likes to take things, makes him laugh." Daniel gripped the edge of the table until the wood dug into his palms. He'd seen such men before. Men who fed on fear, who mistook their own cruelty for strength. They walked through life leaving graves of the spirit, if not of the body. "He won't take you," Daniel said, his words hard as iron. The boy finally turned, eyes wide and uncertain. "How do you know?" "Because I've been where you are," Daniel answered. "And no one came for me. I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd be the one who stood in the way. That's what I'm doing now." Thomas studied him for a long moment, torn between disbelief and desperate hope. His lip trembled, but he swallowed hard and looked away again. He wanted to believe, but belief was dangerous. It had been punished out of him too many times. That night the storm returned, not of snow, but of silence heavy enough to choke. Daniel lay awake on the cot, rifle propped against the wall within reach. Thomas lay curled on a pallet by the fire, still wrapped in Daniel's old blanket, but the boy's body never stilled. He twitched, murmured, whimpered as dreams chased him into deeper fear. Daniel rose more than once to check on him, each time finding the boy's hand clenched into fists, his brow damp with sweat. Near dawn the sound came. Hooves again, but more of them this time. Daniel froze, listening. Not 2 riders, not 3. Half a dozen at least, their horses, breath visible even through the crack in the shutters. Thomas bolted upright, eyes wide, heart racing so fast Daniel could see it hammering beneath his thin shirt. "He's here," the boy gasped. "He brought men." Daniel's jaw set. He reached for the rifle, checked the chamber, then placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. The boy flinched but didn't pull away this time. "You stay inside," Daniel said firmly, "no matter what." Thomas shook his head violently. "He'll kill you if you stand alone." Daniel knelt, meeting the boy's terrified gaze. "I've lived alone long enough. If today's the day I fall, it won't be alone. It'll be for something worth standing for." Before Thomas could protest, the door rattled under the weight of a fist. A voice, rough and mocking, bellowed through the wood. "Carter, thought you could hide my boy in your hole. Thought wrong. Open up, unless you want your place burned to the ground with you in it." Daniel rose, rifle in hand, and opened the door. The porch sagged under the weight of men. Thomas's father sat astride his horse in the center, flanked by 5 others, farmhands, drifters, men with hard eyes and the smell of desperation about them. They weren't here for justice. They were here for spoils. "You made a mistake, Carter," the father growled. "That boy's mine. You don't give him back, I'll take more than just him. I'll take everything you got." Daniel stepped forward, rifle angled but not raised. His voice carried steady as stone. "You sent him out hungry, half dead in the cold. He came to me because he had no choice. He ain't property, not yours, not anyone's." The father's lips curled into a cruel grin. "Blood says otherwise, and blood don't lie." "Blood don't make a man," Daniel shot back. "Choices do, and you've chosen to break your own son." The men shifted uneasily, some exchanging glances. Not all of them carried the same venom. Some followed out of fear, others for pay, but none could deny the truth when it rang that clear. The father's face darkened, his sneer hardening into rage. "Last chance, Carter, step aside." Daniel shook his head. "Not tonight, not ever again." For a moment silence fell. The horses stamped, steam rising from their flared nostrils. The men tightened their grips on reins and weapons, waiting. And then, with a shout, Thomas's father dismounted, boots crunching against the frozen earth. His hand went to the whip at his belt. Thomas, watching from the window, pressed both hands against the glass, his face pale as death. His voice was a whisper only the fire could hear. "Do." Daniel stood firm, rifle steady, eyes locked on the man who had carved terror into the boy's soul. This wasn't about property. It wasn't about pride. It was about ending the cycle before it swallowed Thomas whole. The father cracked the whip once, the sound slicing through the cold air like lightning. The other men flinched. Daniel didn't move. "You think you're stronger than me?" the man sneered. Daniel's voice was low, measured, carrying the weight of years scarred by the same cruelty. "No, I think I'm stronger than the fear you carry with you, and that's enough." The whip rose again. The boy's cry rang from inside the cabin. And in that breathless moment, everything teetered. Between violence and salvation, between loss and the chance at a family neither Daniel nor Thomas had dared to dream of. The whip cracked again, louder this time, the leather splitting the air as if it meant to carve fear into the marrow of every man present. The sound carried like thunder across the empty fields, echoing against the frozen silence of the land. Horses shied, stamping nervously, and the men flanking Thomas's father shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the rancher who stood firm on his porch and the man who wielded violence like a birthright. Inside the cabin, Thomas pressed his face to the glass, his breath fogging the frost until his own reflection blurred. His heart pounded so hard it felt like the glass would shatter beneath it. He had seen this scene 100 times before, the whip raised, his father's sneer twisted with the joy of dominance, but never before had someone stood in the path of that leather. He wanted to scream for Daniel to stop, to step back, to not bring the lash upon himself. But his voice caught, strangled by years of silence forced upon him. Daniel didn't flinch. His rifle was braced steady, barrel low but ready, his body tall and immovable. "That whip won't break me," he said, his words quiet but slicing through the air sharper than the crack of leather. "And it's sure as death won't touch that boy again." The father sneered, his lips curling to reveal teeth yellowed by tobacco, his eyes burning with a cruel light. "You think you can stand between a man and his blood? You think a few kind words make you a father?" He spat into the snow, the dark stain spreading against the white like rot. "He's mine to shape, mine to discipline. You can't change that." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard the same logic before, back when his own father had justified every beating with the claim of discipline, every scar as a lesson. He felt the weight of those words pressing against him now, pressing against Thomas's trembling figure inside the cabin. But unlike the boy, Daniel was no longer a child. He was no longer powerless. "You ain't shaping him," Daniel said flatly. "You're breaking him. There's a difference, and one day you'll see it clear as day when there's nothing left of him but the shadow of your cruelty." The other men stirred at that, their eyes flicking from Daniel to Thomas's father. The truth hung in the air like smoke, undeniable even if they dared not voice it. Men had followed this brute because fear bound them tighter than loyalty. But even fear has limits when exposed to the mirror of truth. The father's face darkened, the sneer giving way to fury. He snapped the whip again, this time aiming the crack near Daniel's boots, the sound sharp enough to draw blood if closer. Daniel didn't budge. "You got one chance," the father hissed, voice low and venomous. "Hand him over or I'll take him. And when I do, I'll burn this place to the ground so no man forgets what happens when they stand against me." Daniel took one step forward, the porch creaking beneath his boots. His rifle lifted now, the barrel rising smooth, steady, the firelight from the cabin glinting faint along the iron. "Then you'll have to step through me first, and I swear before God himself, you won't take another step past this porch." The air thickened, every man watching, waiting for the first spark that would ignite the blaze. Horses shifted, snorting steam into the cold dawn. The whip in the father's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the rage of a man unused to being defied. From inside, Thomas whimpered, a sound too soft for the men outside but sharp enough for Daniel to hear. That sound was all the rancher needed. His grip tightened on the rifle, not from anger, but from the quiet, immovable conviction of a man who had already made peace with his choice. The father's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "You've got no kin, no family. You're nothing but a lonely fool clinging to dirt and wood. Why throw it all away for a boy that ain't yours?" Daniel's chest rose with a slow breath. "Because he deserves a chance at a life that ain't chained by fear, and because no one gave me that chance when I was his age. I won't stand by and watch another boy suffer what I did." For the first time, something flickered in the father's expression, a moment's hesitation, a fracture in his mask of dominance. But it passed quickly, swallowed by rage. He raised the whip high again, stepping forward as if daring Daniel to fire. The standoff stretched long, a taut string ready to snap. The hired men shifted again, eyes unsettled. They had followed this man's orders for coin, but this fight wasn't theirs. They hadn't signed on to witness a boy torn apart by cruelty or a rancher shot down for standing between right and wrong. One of them finally muttered under his breath, "This ain't worth it," and turned his horse slightly aside. Another followed, shifting his gaze away, unwilling to meet Daniel's eyes but unwilling to ride against him either. The father's fury deepened at their wavering. "Cowards," he spat, whip still raised. You'd let one fool shame you. Daniel's voice cut through the growing fracture. You stand alone now. Just you, your whip, and the truth you can't choke down anymore. The father let out a roar, surging forward, whip lashing down. In that instant, Daniel stepped into the strike, the leather grazing his sleeve but finding no purchase as he caught the man's arm mid-swing. The rifle clattered to the porch boards, but Daniel didn't need it now. His grip locked like iron, years of ranch work fueling the strength in his calloused hands. The father struggled, thrashing, but Daniel shoved him back hard, the whip slipping from his grasp and falling useless into the snow. For the first time in years, the man looked unsure, blinking against a resistance he hadn't expected. You've had your last strike, Daniel said, his voice low and unshakable. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Thomas stood in the doorway, blanket still draped around his thin shoulders, eyes wide with terror but fixed on his father. He took one step forward, then another, his voice trembling yet clear. He's right, you'll never break me again. The words fell into the cold air like a stone into water, sending ripples through every man present. The hired hands shifted fully now, some dismounting, some turning their horses away entirely. Even the father's rage faltered for a breath, stunned by the defiance from the very child he had spent years crushing. Daniel released him, shoving him back into the snow. The man stumbled, breath ragged, eyes wild as he scrambled to his feet. His gaze darted from Daniel to Thomas, to the men who no longer stood at his side. For the first time he looked smaller, not in size but in spirit. You'll pay for this, he spat, his voice hoarse with fury and shame, but it lacked the power it once carried. His threats rang hollow now, stripped bare by the truth that no one followed him anymore. He mounted his horse, hands shaking, and with a final glare he wheeled the animal around, spurring it hard. The hooves pounded across the frozen ground as he fled, his shadow shrinking against the pale horizon. Silence followed, broken only by the snorts of the few horses left behind. The hired men scattered without a word, riding off into the trees, their loyalty dissolved into nothing. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, breath sharp, his small fists clenched tight. His father was gone for now, but the weight of years still lingered heavy in his bones. Daniel retrieved his rifle, setting it back against the wall. He turned to the boy, his voice gentle in the quiet aftermath. You stood tall today, Thomas, taller than most men ever do. The boy's lip trembled, tears brimming but held back. He swallowed hard, staring at the snow where his father had fallen. For the first time in his life, the fear had not swallowed him whole. For the first time he had spoken and his voice had been heard. But Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. Men like that didn't disappear into silence. They festered, they returned, and they brought storms with them. The rancher also knew that Thomas couldn't face those storms alone, and neither could he. Come inside, Daniel said softly, resting a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. We'll talk of what comes next. And though the morning light began to break across the snow, brighter than it had in days, both of them felt the shadow that still lingered on the horizon. The cabin was quiet after the storm of voices and threats, but it was not the kind of quiet that settled into peace. It was the fragile hush that follows a battle, when the body still hums with fear, and the mind can't yet believe the danger has passed. Thomas sat hunched at the table, Daniel across from him, the fire throwing long shadows against the walls. Neither spoke at first. The boy's thin hands twisted in the blanket around his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the floorboards as if afraid to look up and find his father looming again in the doorway. Daniel studied him, feeling the weight of the silence. He knew it was too soon to ask questions, too soon to push. A boy doesn't shed years of fear in a single morning, but the sight of him there, worn down, trembling and still carrying the echo of his father's cruelty, cut Daniel deeper than any whip could. At last Thomas whispered, "He'll come back." His voice cracked on the words, fragile but certain. "He always comes back." Daniel leaned forward, folding his arms on the table, his voice steady but gentle. Then we'll be ready when he does. Thomas's eyes flicked up, wide and uncertain, as though the promise itself was impossible to believe. You don't understand, he murmured. You can't stop him. Nobody stops him. I can, Daniel said simply. Not because I'm stronger, not because I've got a rifle and he doesn't, but because I ain't afraid to stand between him and you. Fear's the only thing he's ever had. You take that away and he's just a man. Thomas blinked hard, his lip trembling, tears threatening, but held back with all the stubbornness of a boy who'd been taught to never show weakness. I tried not to be afraid, he admitted softly. Every time he raised his hand, I told myself I wouldn't cry, but I always did. I thought that meant he was right, that I was weak. Daniel's chest ached at the confession. He reached across the table, not grabbing, not forcing, just laying his rough hand near enough for the boy to see. Crying ain't weakness, Thomas. It's proof you're still human. The real weakness belongs to the man who thinks breaking a child makes him strong. For a long moment, Thomas stared at the hand resting on the wood, then slowly, hesitantly, he placed his small fingers atop it. His touch was feather-light, as if testing whether this, too, was a trap. But Daniel didn't move, didn't pull away. He let the boy decide, let him feel what it meant for another's hand to stay steady without harm. Thomas swallowed hard, then drew his hand back quickly, curling it into a fist in his lap. His voice was barely a whisper. If you try to keep me, he'll kill you. He kills everything that gets in his way. Daniel leaned back, his eyes never leaving the boy's. Then let him try. I've lived through worse storms than one man's rage, and if the Lord gives me breath for another day, I'll spend it making sure you ain't left alone in this fight. The boy didn't answer, but something shifted in his expression. A crack in the wall of disbelief, a flicker of light where only darkness had reigned. That afternoon, Daniel set to work around the ranch. He reinforced the barn doors, checked the fences, and stacked wood high near the porch. He didn't speak of why, and Thomas didn't ask. But the boy followed him everywhere, trailing like a shadow, silent but watchful. When Daniel lifted a rail, Thomas fetched nails. When Daniel hauled water, Thomas carried the bucket half full. Every task became a lesson unspoken. Strength wasn't in raising a whip, but in building, preparing, protecting. By evening, Daniel cooked a pot of stew from the last of the venison. Thomas ate more this time, though every bite still carried the caution of a boy who'd learned food could be snatched away at any moment. When he finished, he glanced at Daniel and whispered, "Thank you." Daniel nodded once, the simple words carrying more weight than any oath. Night fell heavy, the wind howling faint around the corners of the cabin. Daniel kept his rifle near, his boots on, ready for the sound of hooves that might come again. But none came. Only the creak of timbers, the pop of fire, and the quiet breaths of the boy who finally, for the first time in years, slept through the night without waking to terror. The days that followed stretched into a fragile rhythm. Thomas began to speak more, not much but enough. He asked about the cattle, about the tools, about the stars that glittered bright above the snow at night. Daniel answered every question, patient and steady, no matter how small. Slowly, the boy's shoulders began to straighten. His eyes no longer darted constantly to the door. The bruises still lingered on his skin, but something deeper began to heal. Still, Daniel knew the peace was temporary. Men like Thomas's father didn't vanish into the trees and lick their wounds forever. They plotted, they returned, and when they did, they came harder than before. That warning arrived 3 nights later. It began with smoke, thin, gray, curling against the moonlight. Daniel smelled it before he saw it, his body tensing instantly. He pushed the door open, stepping onto the porch, and his gut turned cold. The barn was aflame. Fire licked the sky, bright and hungry, the crackle of burning hay carried on the wind. "Thomas," Daniel shouted, his voice sharp. The boy bolted from his pallet, eyes wide with terror as he saw the blaze. Daniel grabbed the water barrels from the porch, thrusting one into Thomas's small hands. "Stay close, keep low," He didn't waste time explaining. The fire needed fighting now. Together they raced toward the barn, the heat searing their faces, sparks showering across the snow. Inside, the cattle bawled, thrashing against their stalls in panic. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. If the fire spread faster, they'd lose everything. He heaved the stall doors open, shouting, driving the terrified beasts into the night. Thomas coughed, choking on smoke, but he didn't run. He dashed back and forth with the barrel, splashing water against the flames with every ounce of strength his small arms could muster. When at last the last of the cattle stumbled free into the field, Daniel grabbed the boy and pulled him back, both of them falling into the snow just as the roof caved inward with a roar, sending sparks shooting into the night. They lay gasping, faces smeared with soot, the fire consuming what could not be saved. And then above the roar of flames came the sound Daniel had been waiting for. Hooves, dozens of them. From the tree line, riders emerged, torches in their hands, their silhouettes glowing orange against the fire. At their head rode Thomas's father, his face twisted in triumph, the blaze painting his sneer with the light of hell itself. "You thought you could take him from me," he shouted, his voice carrying above the crackle of fire. "You thought you could shame me. I'll burn every inch of this land until you learn no man defies me and walks away whole." Thomas froze, eyes locked on the man who had haunted every moment of his life. His breath came in sharp gasps, panic rising, but Daniel gripped his shoulder, steady as stone. "Listen to me," Daniel said firmly, his voice cutting through the boy's fear. "This fire ain't the end, it's the beginning. He can burn barns, fields, anything he touches, but he can't burn the truth. And the truth is, you're free of him now. Do you hear me?" Thomas's eyes brimmed with tears, but he nodded, small and certain. Daniel rose, pulling the boy to his feet, and faced the line of riders, the blaze at his back, the rifle in his hands. Alone on his land, outnumbered, his barn in ashes, he stood tall. For the first time in years, his life was not just his own. It was bound to the trembling child at his side, the child he'd chosen to protect no matter the cost. And in the glow of the flames, as the riders fanned out to surround the cabin, Daniel Carter knew the fight for Thomas's soul, and for their future, had only just begun. The fire roared behind them, flames clawing the sky, but it was not the barn's destruction that made Thomas tremble. It was the sight of his father, perched high on his horse, surrounded by men who carried torches and malice in equal measure. The boy's breath came ragged, his small fists clenched tight at his sides. He had seen his father's wrath before, but never like this, never with a band of riders at his back and fire in his eyes. Daniel stepped forward, the blaze casting his shadow long across the snow. He held the rifle firm, his face hard as the mountains in winter. He had nothing left to lose but the boy at his side, and for that alone he was ready to stand until his last breath. "You brought fire to my land," he said, his voice carrying steady above the crackle of burning wood. "But you'll leave here with nothing." Thomas's father let out a harsh laugh, the sound jagged as broken glass. "You've got spine, Carter, I'll give you that, but spine snaps easy when it's outnumbered." He gestured to the men around him, their torches blazing in the night. "1 man against 10. You think God himself will ride down and save you?" Daniel didn't waver. "God already did. He put this boy on my porch, and that's enough for me." The words stung Thomas's father, though he tried to mask it with another sneer. He turned in his saddle, glaring at his son who stood half hidden behind Daniel. "You think this man cares about you, boy? He'll use you up and cast you aside, same as the rest of the world. You're mine, and you'll crawl back to me or die in the snow where you stand." Thomas flinched, the voice that had ruled his life for so long slicing through him like a blade. His knees buckled, fear rising in waves. But then he felt Daniel's hand rest briefly on his shoulder, firm, steady, unshakable. That touch was not a lash, not a strike. It was a promise. The boy straightened slowly, trembling but lifting his chin, and for the first time he spoke back. "I'm not yours." The words were thin, barely more than a whisper, but in the night they rang like a bell. The men shifted in their saddles, their faces uncertain. Few had ever heard defiance from a child toward the man who claimed to own him. Daniel's chest swelled with quiet pride. He kept his rifle trained on the riders but spoke for Thomas to hear. You see, even he knows the truth. A father don't beat his boy to make him strong. He protects him. He feeds him. He teaches him to stand, not to crawl. The father snarled, rage twisting his face into something beastly. Enough talk. He jerked his hand down, and the men spurred their horses forward, torches flaring. Daniel fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cracking across the valley. The horses reared, some riders jerking their reins, unwilling to charge headlong into gunfire. The group faltered, breaking their advance. Smoke and sparks filled the night, painting everything in orange and black. You want to fight, Daniel shouted. Come and take it. But know this, you won't just face me. You'll answer for every bruise you've laid on that boy, for every lash you called discipline. You'll answer to the truth that every man here sees plain. You're not strong. You're a coward who hides behind a whip. The words struck deeper than any bullet. Several riders shifted uneasily, their torches lowering. One man spat into the snow and turned his horse away. Another followed, muttering something under his breath. Within moments, half the group had peeled off, unwilling to throw their lives away for a tyrant whose only weapon was fear. The father roared, his fury boiling over. Traitors, you'd leave me now. But his voice cracked, stripped of the power it once carried. Fear was losing its hold. The man spat up at him, eyes blazing with hate. You think you've won. He'll never be yours. He's weak. Always will be. Before Daniel could answer, Thomas's small voice cut through the night. I'm not weak. Both men froze. The boy stood at the edge of the porch, his small frame lit by the fire, his eyes wet but fierce. I'm not weak, he repeated, louder this time, his voice shaking but clear. The father's face twisted, but for once he had no words. Daniel released him, stepping back. Hear that? That's the sound of a boy you'll never own again. The father scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, face red with humiliation. He looked at the boy, then at the rancher, then at the men who had turned away, their torches fading into the trees. He was alone, utterly and completely alone. He backed toward his horse, hatred spilling from him like venom. This ain't over, he hissed. I'll see you both rot before I'm done. He mounted, spurred the animal hard, and rode into the dark, the sound of hooves fading until only the crackle of the fire remained. Daniel lowered the rifle fully now, his breath steady but heavy. He turned to Thomas, who stood trembling, tears streaking his soot-stained face. The boy staggered forward, and before Daniel could react, he buried himself against the rancher's chest, sobbing into the coarse fabric of his coat. Daniel wrapped his arms around him, holding him close, steady as stone. You're safe now, he murmured. Safe. But even as he whispered the words, he knew safety was a fragile thing. Men like Thomas's father didn't vanish into the night forever. They returned, festering with revenge. And when he came again, it would be worse. Still, for now, beneath the burning light of the ruined barn, Daniel held the boy and let him weep. For the first time in years, Thomas wept without fear of punishment. He wept because he was free enough to do so. And Daniel Carter, the lonely rancher who had once lived only for silence, found his arms full of purpose at last. The fire smoldered long into the night, collapsing timbers groaning as the barn sank into ash. Daniel and Thomas sat on the porch, the boy wrapped in a blanket, his eyes fixed on the embers that still spat sparks into the cold air. He had cried until no tears remained, and now he sat hollow, exhausted but strangely lighter, as though each tear had carried away a piece of the weight that had bound him for years. Daniel sat beside him, silent, his rifle resting across his lap. His body was tired, his muscles sore from the struggle, but his mind refused rest. He knew this was not an end, only a pause. Men like Thomas's father didn't slink into the night and surrender. They brooded. They gathered. They came back with vengeance sharper than before. Still, for this one night, Daniel let himself breathe. He looked at the boy, saw the way Thomas leaned just slightly against his arm, as if testing whether this man's presence could be trusted. Daniel didn't move, didn't press, but the quiet weight of that small gesture filled him with something he had thought long dead. Not joy, not peace exactly, but belonging. When dawn came, gray and brittle, the barn was nothing but blackened ruins, smoke curling faint into the sky. The cattle milled in the snow nearby, restless but alive. Daniel set to work at once, salvaging what he could while Thomas trailed after him. The boy fetched buckets, hauled scraps of wood, even tried to hammer nails with hands still blistered from the night before. He stumbled often, but he never quit, and Daniel let him work. Every blow of the hammer was more than labor. It was defiance against the shadow that had chased him. By midday, Daniel paused, wiping soot from his brow. He found Thomas standing with his shoulders squared, holding a beam steady despite its weight. The boy's face was tight with effort, but his eyes were fierce. Daniel took the load from him gently, setting it aside. "You've got grit, Thomas," he said, "more than most men twice your age." The boy swallowed, pride flickering in his expression, though it was quickly masked with doubt. "He said I was useless," he murmured, almost to himself. "Said I'd never be more than a burden." Daniel crouched, looking him straight in the eyes. "He lied. You hear me? Every bruise he left, every word he spat, it wasn't the truth. It was fear. He feared what you could be if you ever learned you weren't weak." For a long moment, Thomas stared back, his lip trembling. Then, slowly, he nodded. The words sank deeper than Daniel expected. That night Daniel cooked what little they had left, beans, bread, and the last scrap of salted meat. It wasn't much, but when they sat at the table, Thomas's posture had changed. He didn't hunch or flinch with every sound. He sat straighter, his hands steady as he held his spoon. For the first time, he ate without looking over his shoulder. After supper, as the firelight softened the room, Thomas finally spoke the question that had been burning in him for days. "Why'd you help me? You didn't have to. You could have shut the door and let me go back." Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. The answer had lived in him all along, though he hadn't put it into words until now. "Because once I was you, alone, afraid. Nobody opened the door for me, and I swore if I ever got the chance, I'd be that door for someone else." Thomas's eyes glistened, but he didn't cry. Instead, he whispered, "Then, am I yours now?" The words struck Daniel like a hammer. He looked at the boy, small, scarred, but unbroken, and felt something shift inside him, something he had walled off for years. "If you want to be," he said softly, "then yes, you're mine." For the first time, Thomas smiled. It was faint, fragile, but real. And in that smile, Daniel saw the beginning of something greater than survival. He saw family. But the peace lasted only days. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew sharp with frost, hoofbeats thundered again in the distance. Daniel stiffened, hand going instinctively to his rifle. Thomas froze, panic flashing across his face. He whispered, "He's back." But when the riders came into view, it wasn't just his father. It was a mob, dozens of men, their torches bright against the twilight, their shouts carrying across the fields. At their center rode Thomas's father, his face twisted with a madness deeper than before. "You think you won," he bellowed, his voice carrying like a curse. "You humiliated me, burned my pride to ash. Now I'll burn you both until nothing's left but bone." The riders spread out, encircling the cabin, their numbers overwhelming. Daniel stepped onto the porch, Thomas clinging to his side. His rifle felt heavier than it ever had before, not because of its weight, but because of what was at stake. He raised his voice, calm but unyielding. "This ends tonight. You'll not take another step toward this boy. You'll not take another breath that threatens him." The father sneered, his madness spilling into laughter. "And what will you do, Carter? One man against 20. You'll fall, and he'll crawl back to me like he was born to." Before Daniel could answer, Thomas stepped forward, voice small but carrying into the night. "I'll never go back." The crowd stilled, the boy's defiance breaking through the fury. His father's face twisted, rage boiling over. "You ungrateful wretch!" He spurred his horse forward, whip raised high. But before the strike could fall, Daniel fired. The rifle's crack split the night, the shot ringing across the valley. The whip fell into the snow, severed from the hand that held it. The horse reared, throwing the man hard into the ground. He scrambled to his feet, eyes wild, but the power was gone. His men wavered, their torches lowering, their loyalty unraveling. Daniel stepped down from the porch, each stride steady, rifle leveled. "This is your last chance. Leave this land, leave this boy, or you'll not walk away again." The father's breath came ragged, hatred burning in his gaze, but the fight was gone. He saw it in the eyes of the men who no longer followed, in the boy who no longer feared him, in the rancher who stood unbroken. With a final curse, he staggered to his horse, mounted, and fled into the dark. This time, no one followed. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the crackle of torches dropped into the snow. The riders dispersed, vanishing into the trees until only Daniel and Thomas remained. The boy sagged against him, trembling, but his eyes shone with something new, hope. "He's gone," Thomas whispered, "really gone." Daniel set a hand on his shoulder, steady as bedrock. "Yes, and he won't touch you again, not while I draw breath." The boy pressed closer, resting his head against the rancher's side. For the first time, he felt safe enough to believe the words. The cabin still stood, the barn lay in ruins, the land bore scars of fire and fear. But within those walls, a bond had been forged stronger than blood. Daniel Carter, once a lonely rancher, no longer faced the world in silence. And Thomas, once a boy broken by fear, had found more than shelter. He had found a father. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of ash and snow, but for the first time in years, Daniel smiled. Whatever storms the frontier still held, they would face them together, not as a man and a boy bound by chance, but as a family bound by choice.